Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. Hello and welcome to For Your Consideration, the podcast featuring roundtable discussions re-evaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm Mike Josic.
And I'm Dustin Friesnan.
Thanks for joining us. This week we're going to be talking about John Carpenter's 1982 science fiction horror film, The Thing.
Also known as that movie which it's not the remake of the prequel, it's the sequel to that prequel, which is based off the novella, but it's closer to the novella. There's a lot of the things. This is the thing that's the thing. The good thing.
So The Thing was directed by John Carpenter, produced by David Foster and Lawrence Terman. Screenplay was by Bill Lancaster, based on a novella, Who Goes There, by John W. Campbell Jr. It starred Kurt Russell, Wilford Brimley, T.K. Carter, David Clennon, Keith David, Richard Dysart, Charles Hallahan, Peter Maloney, Richard Masur, Donald Moffat, Joel Paulus, Thomas Waits, Norbert Weiser, and Larry J. Franco. Oh, and Jed the dog.
Who did not receive enough credit for his outstanding work.
Music was by Ennio Morricone, cinematography by Dean Cundy. It was edited by Todd Ramsey and distributed by Universal Pictures. Release date was June 25th, 1982. And generally this movie was loathed upon release. It bombed at the box office, partly because of E.T. being out there and nobody wanted to watch a paranoid, unpleasant, downer film. And also the critics butchered it.
Probably didn't help that it was also released the same day as Blade Runner.
But that was also a movie that failed and got butchered by critics.
But now everybody loves all of a sudden.
Kind of like The Thing. Now, The Thing has gone on to pretty much be considered a masterpiece of suspense and horror. On the Sight and Sound list of the greatest films of all time, it places 377th on the critics' poll and 546th on the director's poll. So with that out of the way, Dustin, what did you think of the film?
This is my favorite film of all time. This is probably my 15th viewing or so, give or take. And every time I see it, I'm able to come in and find something new. This time, I was mostly focused on the timeline, and I still can't quite piece together exactly when who gets turned. I think I got the first half of the movie sort of figured out, but after that, and that's definitely one of the awesome things about this movie, the whole what it shows you and what it doesn't. And you can always go in there and try to piece stuff together, and no matter how much you're paying attention and how much you've seen, you're never 100% sure, which is great because the movie's focused on that paranoia. That's what it's about.
I like the fact that because you don't get to see everything, because you're kind of seeing things as they're being revealed to the characters, and mostly you're seeing it through McCready's point of view. You said you were trying to work out the timeline, and like honestly, I've tried to do that in the past, and mostly I've just given up on subsequent viewings because regardless of whether you can actually piece together who gets taken when and what happens and come up with like a set sequence of events, it doesn't really matter. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, I know what you mean. That's not the point. It's not a mystery in that sense. It's a suspense, and it keeps the suspense going.
And even if you do think, oh, well, I'm not sure if this lines up, you can't just straight out utterly disprove it as well. Like there's always that feeling of there's something I don't know. This movie does a really good job of putting that across.
There's a lot of parts where you definitely don't know. Like there'll be scenes where they're just all shouting at each other, "You were alone. Where were you? What were you doing?" And they don't answer it because everyone's just freaking out, and then someone tries to calm them down. But you know that there's periods of time where nobody knows what's going on, where nobody is quite sure where everybody was, and there's that open enough space that anything could have happened. Especially when you see that there's all these shadowy figures walking around during these times.
And because everything is so reactive in the film, as an audience, like you're being carried along. They've done such a masterful job of scripting, directing, and editing, and with the pacing of the thing, as an audience member, you're kind of picked up and carried along. It's like a ride, but a really slow ride.
There was a ride apparently at Universal Studios.
Was there really?
Apparently, where you're going down, or at least like an exhibit, something like that.
That would be awesome, not knowing if the guy next to you in the tram was human.
It was more, everything was sort of picked up and brought to a research station, and you're exploring the research station. I just read a quick little blurb about it, so I don't exactly know.
I'm always confused, like, I've seen the documentary, and I experienced this movie for the first time, I think, when I was 9. I caught it on, like, it was on satellite TV. It was on one of the movie channels, and I was at somebody's house, and it was just kind of on, and I was, like, transfixed. And I think probably 100% of the people that I know who've watched the movie, young or old, they always watch it, and they're just like, that was a fantastic movie. So I'm kind of puzzled at how the reaction was at the time. You watch the documentary, you see the really depressing comments that John Carpenter has made about his experience at the time in 1982 when this was released, and it's like, how did they not see it?
I was reading a lot of critiques of the movie, and some of them were just scathing. Like, Ebert was giving the movie just, oh, this is such garbage, and it's, what movie were you watching? I want to know this. But it's almost sort of a bit of the times, I guess. Maybe in the 80s they just weren't ready for this kind of thing. I don't know.
But I think, I mean, ultimately, yes, effects-wise, they probably weren't ready for something like this. There was a lot of what we now coin body horror. But that whole paranoia and the whole suspense and buildup of tension, I mean, that's classic Hitchcock. That's filmmakers have been doing that for decades previous to this. So why? And the performances in this movie are solid. Like, I just don't understand that mindset of watching this, and like, if you reacted badly and said, oh, it's gross, or it made me feel yucky or whatever, like, that's different than saying the characters are bad, this is a terribly structured movie. Like, we talked
and that's what Ebert said. He said the characterization was bad and was poorly structured. But actually, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because most of the stuff I was reading, it was people talking about how it was a big gross out thing, barf bag, blah, blah, blah. Nowadays, we're also desensitized to violence, that this kind of thing, it's basically, hey, that's some cool effects. And really, 1982, this is better effects than we get in some movies these days. Especially if you start talking about the remake, and if you look at the comparison of the practical effects versus the digital effects they have with whatever documentary is there, the practical effects are fantastic. It's, like, amazing. So back in the 80s, what do you have to compare that with? Hellraiser wasn't out quite then, was it?
I'm trying to think of what the real gross out stuff in 82 would have been. I mean, people probably would have still been talking about The Exorcist at that point.
Yeah, and I remember people saying that The Exorcist was, like, all sorts of gross and scary and whatnot, but these days she pees herself and pukes some pea soup. Like, it's nothing extreme like you'd get nowadays, where all of a sudden you've got Eli Roth putting out torture porn, you've got your French extremism movement putting out stuff like Martyrs, or the Saw movies, all this kind of stuff.
But
like,
Evil Dead would have been out in 82, wouldn't it?
It wasn't super gory itself, though, was it? I know there was a lot of sort of scares, but it didn't have anything behind the scares. Like, here, the suspense might have been sort of overshadowed by the practical effects, all the supposed gore, all the crazy stuff that people weren't used to, and that's what they come out remembering.
It could be possible that, I mean, there were movies out there that were scarier or more horrible or gross, but because this was a big studio release, and because it was from the guy who had given us Halloween, and it was a remake of the Howard Hawks Thing from Another World, maybe people went into it expecting something very different, and they got something very visceral and maybe too well made. and because of that, they walked out of it feeling icky.
I've often said that expectation is almost 90% of how you're going to come out of any sort of movie. When I go into a bad movie and I expect it to be a bad movie, I can enjoy it for what it is. But when I go into a movie and all I've heard was people lauding it and saying how great this movie is, often I come out a little disappointed because I was expecting more. Expectation is a whole lot. And as you said, if people were like, E.T., hey, we're going into this movie and it's going to be sort of fun and whatnot. Yeah, you're not getting that. It's fun, just not in an E.T. kind of way.
It had so many moments that I remember picking out, you know, as that 9 or 10-year-old kid, and every time I've watched this movie, I wait for those moments. I treasure those moments. I love it when Clark's spider head is crawling away, and what's his name? Peters? Paulson?
Childers?
No.
Windows?
No, the guy who was
Palmer.
Palmer. Like when the Clark's spider head is crawling away, and Palmer says, "You've got to be fucking kidding me." Or when McCready breaks in through the supply room window.
And he's just paranoid as shit. He's like, "You just fucking try it."
He's got by the red flare light, and he's got all the frost, and he's so cold.
His eyes are just bug-eyed. Or one of my favorites is Blair talking about, "I'm okay now. You can let me in. I'm not going to hurt nobody." And you've got the noose just
I'm hearing
hanging
funny
right
noises,
there.
Guys. That noose is so amazing because they don't draw attention to it. It's just there.
You see McCready, he looks in and he drops his head for a second. It's like little subtle things like that I look for these days in this movie.
And of course, Gary on the couch.
Or Child's freaking out. "Let me out!" Just jumping up and down. The constant cuts during that point after the first reveal of the monster and that the test works. They cut every single time someone is disqualified, and it's hilarious at that point. They've gone from this very suspenseful thing to something that actually becomes hilarious, and it's great.
I think Todd Ramsey doesn't get enough credit for this movie. Like, you brought up the editing in that testing scene where they're all tied to the couch after Palmer is revealed to be the Thing and they have the big moment and Windows dies.
Spoilers, by the way.
We're a spoiler show. In the first episode.
Oh no, I'm just reminding them that spoilers are occurring.
But yeah, as soon as that scene is over and you see Windows' body kind of burn and he dies, especially like that editing in that sequence where as soon as someone is revealed, like the next shot is them standing next to McCready with a flamethrower, and it's just kind of running with that whole. It's just a really well put together scene, and it's a way to sort of expedite that whole process because the suspense has basically been killed by that moment where the blood jumps out.
And at that point, you know it would be kind of weird to do it yet again.
And it actually works in its favor that the suspense is kind of killed, but you still sort of have that tension. And then to not have anyone else be the Thing, and then to have Gary have his outburst.
It's almost sort of a comedic moment just to bring up the mood, I think. It's very, in Shakespearean plays, it's the third act is very dark, and then the fourth act sort of levity. Something along those lines. Either way, it's a classic writing move.
Carpenter said he was afraid that people would laugh at the movie, and I think he was worried that they would laugh at the movie because of sort of the effects and the outrageousness of it. But, I mean, this movie does have some very genuinely funny moments. Some of those moments that I mentioned, like Gary on the couch, or Clark's spider head crawling away, or, I mean, I laugh when I see McCready frozen in that room, and he's like flexing his hand afterwards and holding that flamethrower. Like, I don't know, I get a kick out of just how paranoid and crazy these guys have gotten. I get like this weird sort of morbid joy out of it. So
it feels so very real to me, and that's one of the things I love about it. They're all tired, they've been dealing with this nonsense, and there's so many points in this movie where I just imagine that they're standing around doing whatever they're doing and saying, "Fuck this shit." Clark runs up, sees the Thing in the cage, frozen like a deer in the headlights, which is what happens when crazy shit happens to most people, and then he just kicks the door shut, doesn't go to explore. It's like, nope, fuck this shit, close the door. Windows, runs over, grabs the gun, fuck this shit, I can't open the thing, I'm just busting it, I don't care.
There were two moments, every time I watch this movie I pick up something new. There were two moments, this viewing. The first was when McCready shoots Clark. Shit, I've been saying Clark's Spiderhead. Clark is the dog guy.
Norris's Spiderhead. Our apologies.
I'm not going to go back and edit that out. Don't hate me. Do not comment on this.
Do comment on this.
When McCready shoots Clark, there's that moment where Kurt Russell performs it not just as oh, I took down a threat. He feels bad. He has no idea how he's supposed to feel in that moment.
He was surprised. He backs away. He's like, what did I just do?
He doesn't know if he's killed a real person or if he's disabled the thing. He doesn't know how to feel about it. And I think that's brilliant. And the other moment was... Shit, I can't remember now.
Isn't that always the way?
I'll try and remember what the other moment is. But I want to ask you, after we finished Jaws and we were talking about this movie, you had said that you had watched it again recently, and in the process of watching it, you were watching it kind of with your more critical eye that you would apply sort of to the movies that we're watching for the show, and you were kind of poking some holes in it, and you felt bad about that. I kind of had that in mind when I was watching it this time, and I still think this is a perfect movie. I still think it's flawless. Did you feel that again, or did you come out of this different?
I didn't feel it quite so much this time again. I see some of the holes that I was looking at, but I was once again looking at it with another different eye. I was looking at some stuff like, as I said earlier, there'll be points when everybody's alone, and if you're being like purely pragmatic, you could say, well, why was anyone alone? Why weren't they in groups of 3 at all times? And each one of them had like however many people armed, and you just sort of subdivide and make things as perfect as you can in that sense. But people might not have been thinking, or they might have been too scared to be together. I know certain points. I'm not going with Palmer. I'm not going with Windows or whatever. People just, they wanted to be alone at certain points. Or even if you just think of the fact that they've all been awake for how long at this point.
That's the other thing.
And the shock. Because Blair gives Clark some shit over why was the dog walking around. I don't know, like, we just had some Norwegian guy blow himself up and another was shot. Like, shit's going down here. I didn't think about putting away the dog. I'm sorry. And that's what I realized this time. That, yeah, a lot of the errors that people might have done if you were looking at it like a scientist trying to plot out the perfect course of action, knowing everything that was going on, well, there was some shit going down. What do you want? And I was seeing it as much more reasonable. Expecting people to behave perfectly doesn't quite pan out. And that's what was bringing the realism this time, which made me enjoy it even more this viewing.
I want to talk about Wilford Brimley briefly, but before that, you mentioned the no sleep thing. That's the other thing that I noticed. I think you were the one that brought it up while we were watching, and in the 30 odd years that I've been watching this movie, it's never occurred to me that after that line where McCready says, in 6 hours the storm is going to hit, like, nobody sleeps past that point. So I think they were 48 hours in when things kind of started going south, when Fuchs goes out, when Knowles ditches him because he sees the light on in his cabin.
And everybody's just sort of shuffling about until action happens, at which point it's a burst of adrenaline and everyone's just freaking out and acting all crazy.
So decisions that they're making and things that they're doing, it's like, yeah, they're exhausted, they're tired, they're paranoid, like, they're doing the best they can under very difficult circumstances, and any strange choices they make or any kind of levels of irrational irritability, I guess it's not irrational, I mean, their lives are in danger, but yeah. So anyways, Wilford Brimley owns this movie. There's so much joy that I get out of watching Brimley, from his opening scenes to his growing paranoia to the takedown in the lab when they hit him with the door and then McCready throws those 2 punches to take him down.
I want it to be us!
Like,
those
so
2
many
punches, by the way, were the worst special effects in the movie.
The sound effect?
Yeah, the sound effect.
Yeah.
That is the worst sound effect in the movie.
But Wilford Brimley, I don't think anybody really remembers him in this movie until they watch the movie again. They probably think of him in those Ewok movies before they think of him in this movie. But he's just stellar. I mean, I kind of feel like, even though McCready is sort of your central character, like, Blair is the anchor, the
He's sort of separate from the rest. He's pushing ahead a lot of the story with what he figures out. And his line of questioning, which is actually fair, he feels a lot like a sociopath to me, because he's not talking to anyone. He's not showing any emotion. He's very analytical about everything. But then he loses it a couple of times. And those times are glorious.
But you were talking about when he was sitting there questioning Clark, how long have you been with the dog? How long has the dog been free out of the pen? Like, that performance is so pitch perfect. He just brings so much sort of gravity. And when he comes up with the idea that this thing is like, when he's talking about, that's not dog, that's imitation. I mean, the way he delivers that, there's no way that you go, oh, well, that sounds like a ridiculous, silly concept. You believe him. You're just like, oh, this is absolutely happening now, and we have to deal with this.
He definitely brings that. There's no doubt as to anything that Blair says at any point.
And there is kind of a tenderness to him, but there is also like that real surly old man that he can turn into as well.
And even if you remember him as Mr. Diabetes, this is how he completely overshadows that with his performance in this.
I also want
to... Terrible meme. That song, Diabetes, the techno remix.
Oh, yeah.
Terrible. Why am I even bringing it up?
I also want to just bring up briefly the Ennio Morricone score. Some people have said, like, why didn't John Carpenter score this? I think this is one of the best film scores. It's amazing, and I feel like, I mean, Morricone has scored many films. Many of them are amazing, but I feel like the music in this movie is so pivotal to creating mood, maintaining mood. This is a movie that's not afraid of silence, to have characters not talking, you're literally watching MacReady sitting there thinking about things, and to have Morricone sort of underscore that, it amplifies that performance, and it really works for me. One
of the things that doesn't quite age too well are the computers and the technology, the computer simulation especially. Like that, it's pretty lame. But one thing that actually I noticed this time that, as far as I'm concerned, always fixes this in movies is they had the date, the year, at the very beginning of the movie. So you don't have to have it age. It doesn't have to feel like, okay, this is happening in the present. It wasn't. It was happening 30 years ago. Just, I really like those small things. Probably might not have been intentional. They might not have been thinking about that at the time, but it really helps age the movie a bit nicer.
I have the same feeling whenever I watch The X-Files, because The X-Files takes place in whatever year that season was released. So it started in 93, and so when you're watching those old seasons, you're not like, oh, this show didn't age well. It's like, it's 1993. Same with The Thing, it's 82. I mean, this movie ages very well on so many levels. But yeah, the computers are like the big standout. And
watching him play chess, okay, fine, that's a machine that doesn't do anything but play chess. And he gets pretty bitter and pours his friggin' whiskey into it. But that simulation with Blair where it's just those two little colored things going across, I don't even know that they'd even have that in the 80s. That seems utterly ridiculous to me. But it's the 80s. We don't even know what computers were like in the 80s.
Well, I was there.
I was technically there too, which is why I'm not too sure that the computer could have simulated anything like that.
It's definitely something to sort of move the story forward, and yeah, but like you said, it takes place in 82, everything belongs in 82, and right off the bat, you're not judging like, oh, well, that looks silly because, oh, their hair is funny, or, oh...
They actually didn't have outrageous hairstyles.
They didn't. MacReady had an outrageous hat, though.
Cowboy hat in friggin' Antarctica, and he made sure to carry it around.
That was the best hat. I love that hat.
That hat makes a special appearance in the video game.
There's so many things I love about this movie. I'm actually smiling talking about it.
One thing that the movie was given a lot of criticism for was having no women whatsoever in the movie.
That came later, though, didn't it?
I actually forget exactly when it came, but I remember it was criticized for that, and it was a specific choice that John Carpenter made. And actually, I like that choice, simply because that's not what the movie is about. They didn't have any sort of romantic sideline, which happens in so many movies. You watch any action movie, any horror movie, and I usually these days say, okay, just shut up and fuck already so that we can get that over with. Because it happens in almost every movie you watch, and it becomes annoying. It's not what the movie's about. We don't need to have a romantic plot in every movie. And this movie completely avoids it outright.
I think it's pretty accurate. Like, I don't know how many women would be working in Antarctica in 1982. It's also possible that that was just the crew in 1982. At that time, like maybe some women would cycle in. I don't know. Some people have accused the movie of being kind of misogynistic because of it. I agree. I think there's nothing wrong with having a movie with an all-male cast. There's nothing wrong with having a movie with an all-female cast. It wasn't done specifically to like spite a female audience or cater to a male audience. It was a choice. And, you know, even the remake prequel thing that came out in 2011, I think it was 2011, as much as I don't mind that movie and as much as I like Mary Elizabeth Winstead, I think there was, even between her and Joel Edgerton, I think there was some sexual tension. And I think there were characters that did have relationships in the Norwegian crew, because I think there were women in the Norwegian crew.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it just...
That's not what the movie's about. And sometimes it can take away if it's done a little too overtly. A subtle, like, relationships happen, sure, but that doesn't have to be what every movie's about.
There's a simplicity to this story and this movie, and I don't know if in 1982 they could have had a female character in the movie and not have had some sort of romantic relationship. I agree. I think they could totally do that now. That's something that people are okay with, but that was something that at that time, I mean, you had brought up the point where you said that there was a woman in The Thing from Another World, and I said, yes, I think she was a secretary, and she was definitely kind of a romantic interest, and I think, if I remember correctly, she was a bit of a damsel in distress as well. She was somebody to save.
So it was almost a lose-lose situation. It would have been really hard to throw in there and not point it out, which is exactly why Carpenter chose to avoid it in the first place.
It's also a weird thing to bring up. Like, I've spoken to female friends where I bring up, you know, oh yeah, this is a movie that people have accused of being misogynistic or whatever, and they're like, until you brought it up, it never even occurred to me that it's an all-male cast.
The same actually happened to me until I read those criticisms. I was like, yeah, you're right. Huh.
Yeah, there's like 10 dudes in this movie, including the Norwegian dude and, you know, Jed the dog. Although some of those dogs might have been female.
This is true. We don't know.
We don't know.
I didn't check, I'm going to admit.
We didn't check under the hood.
Although those dogs were fantastically trained. That one Jed the dog is just amazing in this movie.
Yeah, if there's anybody who can beat Kurt Russell, Keith David, and Wilford Brimley in this movie, it's Jed the dog. The creepiest moments with that dog staring out the window, or every time it stops and like...
That dog feels like it knows exactly what's going on. Like behind us, like the John Carpenter would say cut and then just talk to the dog and the dog would just nod. You feel like that could happen.
That dog makes me feel deeply uncomfortable every time I watch this movie. I'm going to have to watch the documentary again because I remember thinking that I think that dog has like genius level intelligence and probably was, you know, wrote the software for the computer effects or something on the movie. But I think I remember someone saying that dog was like really difficult, and I don't remember for sure. And I don't know if I'm going to leave this in the recording, but I'm definitely going to like go and check out and just see if that was true, because if that was true, like the director and editor did amazing jobs.
One other thing related to to any sort of prejudice or bigotry that might be going on, a lot of horror movies, slasher movies, are teased and mocked for the fact that the black guy dies immediately. It's basically, if you're black, you're dead. That's all there is to it. It's lampooned nowadays a whole lot, but in here, you've got two black characters. They're in the last 4 people, and one of them is the only 2 survivors.
And we don't know what happened to Knowles.
So it's definitely, it doesn't follow a lot of tropes at all. I'm not sure it follows any tropes. That's what I'll look for next time, actually.
I know that there was discussion about Morricone winning the Oscar that he won for The Hateful Eight, and this being one of my favorite Morricone scores, I've always felt this should have been an Oscar-worthy score. And I do think it's interesting that there was like 2 or 3 music cues off of the Thing soundtrack that he wrote that did not get used in the Thing film that he repurposed for The Hateful Eight, which he won the Oscar for. So I kind of feel that in a very circuitous kind of way, he did kind of win an Oscar for The Thing.
He almost won a Razzie for his score on this, however. So what does that tell you?
People are dumb. So yeah, Dustin, I should ask, is there anything you want to cover about this movie we haven't covered yet?
Not really. Like Jaws, this is a movie that I can't really think of anything super critical to say about it, which unfortunately means that we're sort of just lauding the movie and just saying nothing but great things about it. But unlike some of the other movies we've covered, it's easier to just keep talking about this one because I'm such a big fanboy of it.
All right, so let's move from the discussion segment to the judgment segment. I think everybody knows where this is going, but Dustin, do you feel that this is a masterpiece or a museum piece?
I think this is both. It fits everywhere. Of course, it's my favorite movie of all time, so I'm not gonna not say that, unless it's... No, I guess I could be saying that it's a terrible movie, but I just love it anyway. But no, this movie is fantastic. Everyone should see it, and it's finally getting some more of the praise that it deserves as it becomes reevaluated in later times. I think that the sequel, prequel sort of deal, the pre-sequel... it's so difficult talking about all that stuff.
Reimagining sequel...
Reimagined
prequel.
Pre-sequel. I think that was somewhat disappointing. I have to see it again because I was sort of hoping for more of this. But this movie, it will last forever, as far as I'm concerned. This is definitely a film that's going to stand the test of time, as it already has in my eyes.
I agree. And, I mean, I'm full on into the masterpiece club. And often what I use as kind of a barometer for stuff like this, when the 2011 remake, sequel, prequel...
Pre-sequel make.
When it came out, I was watching this movie a lot, and it caught the interest of my kids, and I remember thinking, they were probably like 13, 15 years old at the time, and I remember wondering, like, ooh, should they watch it? And I was like, you know what? Yeah, they should, because it's just so good. And they loved it. They ate it up, and I think when you've got that kind of multi-generational thing going where we're all seeing the same things and loving the same things, and they're not like, oh, Dad, that looks terrible because the special effects are blah, or the, you know, whatever. I think that's the sign of a movie that is going to just keep on keeping on, and probably
a movie that you can be like, I remember in my day, and you show it to your kids and they have the same joy you did.
50 years from now, I think people are still going to be looking at this movie and going, you know, the same way that we look back on movies like Psycho or, you know, old Murnau films and go, that's where this thing started, or that's, you know, that was like the peak of the form at the time. So all right, so that's another film where there's 2 votes for masterpiece for The Thing,
even though they weren't necessarily generally considered super great.
Oh no, Jaws was like a huge box office. Jaws was the summer blockbuster.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
Even though this one wasn't initially appreciated as well as it could have been.
So, bravo, The Thing. You've done well. Be sure to check us out on the Facebook page, and as always, follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @FYC Show. If you need to send an email, we're fycshowmail@gmail.com, and we're on all the social media. And with that, we call a wrap on this episode of For Your Consideration.
Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.
I'm Mike Josick.
And I'm Dustin Friesen.
Take care.
Thoughts out.